They said his hat was too wide, his steps too slow, his smile too easy to misunderstand. They said the new gardener didn't belong in their town, let alone in the courtyard of First Grace Church, where even the stones carried the weight of sermons. They whispered in the pews, in the parking lot, behind coffee cups and hymn books. And yet, on a damp Monday morning in early spring, Eli Grayson arrived. His truck bore the dust of long roads. His boots carried the color of distant soil. He stepped down without urgency, as if the land itself had called him home. No one greeted him, though several watched through cracked curtains and smudged windows. He wore a linen shirt faded from sunlight and a woven straw hat tilted low. He didn't wave. He didn't speak. He just walked the perimeter of the church garden, more weeds than flowers now. His fingers trailing along broken wood fences, his eyes tracing invisible outlines in the air. Pastor James Aldridge stood by the chapel door, arms folded across his chest. A man of rules, silence, and stained glass. For decades, he had buried wives, baptized newborns, and condemned what he called the turning tide of this world. But something about the man in the hat made his jaw tighten. Not in anger, something more uncertain, more human. James had never met Eli Grayson, or so he thought. Behind him, Dorothy May muttered through pursed lips, loud enough for her circle to hear, soft enough to avoid being called rude. Is that him, the one they say came from the shelter near Nashville, the one who paints flowers on his own boot? They chuckled, the kind of laughter that comes from discomfort more than humor. The church committee hadn't been consulted about hiring Eli. James had made the decision alone. Perhaps that was the first sign something inside him was shifting, though he would never have admitted it, not then. Eli made no promises. He didn't show sketches or speak of plans. He simply unloaded 3 things from the back of his truck: a sapling with roots wrapped in burlap, a crate of river stones, and a wooden bench worn smooth by weather and time. No one asked why he placed the bench facing east. No one dared question the absence of flowers or the silence that followed him. Luke Aldridge watched from his bedroom window, 2 stories above. The pastor's only child, 17 and always half a step behind his father's expectations. Luke had heard the whispers. He'd felt the weight of being raised in a home built more on reverence than warmth. He didn't know why, but he couldn't stop watching the man in the garden. That night, while his father reviewed old sermons under the yellow light of his study, Luke stayed up scrolling through the gardener's name on his phone. Nothing came up, no website, no business address, not even a Facebook page. Just a blurry photo of a community garden 2 towns over, with someone kneeling beside a patch of wildflowers. The caption read, "Let them grow how they were meant to." Luke saved the image. Meanwhile, James stared at a note he had scribbled hours earlier on the back of an envelope. 3 words: "Grace isn't safe." He didn't know why he wrote it. He didn't know if he believed it. But something about Eli's presence, quiet, steady, uninvited, had cracked something that had stayed sealed for too long. No one knew that decades earlier, a teenage boy had stood in that same courtyard during a thunderstorm, soaked and trembling, asking for one night of shelter. That boy had been turned away. James had been the one to sign the refusal form. But names fade, faces change, and time has a cruel way of circling back. This story doesn't begin with acceptance. It begins with tension. With soil that's been scorched, with eyes that still avoid, and with hearts that don't know how to beat outside their doctrine. But something had taken root that morning, not in the ground, in them. If you believe stories can grow where silence once lived, tap into Heartstories and subscribe for more powerful narratives that don't just speak, they heal. The first thing Eli did was remove the dying azaleas near the church sign. He didn't ask permission, didn't explain why. Just bent over, gloved hands firm, lifting root after root until only bare soil remained. By noon, a single pair sapling stood in their place, thin, young, reaching for a sky that hadn't yet decided whether to bless or burn it. Around the base, he laid river stones carefully, like they were relics. Then came a small wooden sign, staked into the earth beside the tree, "Throw stones at me, I will still bloom." By that evening, Dorothy May had seen it. She stood at the window of the fellowship hall with a glass of unsweetened tea in her hand and bitterness in her voice. "Mocking scripture now," she whispered. "That's what it is. He's quoting the book of opinions, not the word." No one challenged her, not directly, but they watched. From afar, the church janitor paused longer than usual by the sign. The Sunday school teacher took a photo when no one was looking. Even Pastor James lingered, longer than he meant to, as if trying to decipher a language he'd once known but forgotten. Eli never explained his choices. The bench came next. Placed not under the tree, but across the courtyard, facing east. People assumed he'd eventually add flowers or a trellis or something beautiful. But days passed, and nothing more came. He added a path instead. Broken tiles, scavenged from the remains of a collapsed community center 2 towns over, they spiraled inward toward the bench, uneven but intentional. When someone asked why the bench didn't face the sanctuary, Eli shrugged. Not all prayers happen inside walls. Luke noticed something different in the garden each day. A bluebird house fashioned from a hollowed-out hymn book. A vine growing deliberately around an iron post shaped like a shepherd's crook. And silence, so much silence. Eli worked without headphones, without humming, without sermon. One afternoon after school, Luke walked the spiral path. He sat at the bench, alone, and just waited for what? He didn't know. Maybe for God. Maybe for himself. Later that night, he stood outside his father's study, heart hammering. The air in the house was heavy with the scent of cedar and old paper. He watched the flicker of lamplight under the door and held his breath. Then, he stepped in. "Dad," he said. James didn't look up. "I think I'm gay." There was no thunderclap, no plate shattering, no shouting, just the ticking of the wall clock and the sound of his father setting down his pen. James exhaled slowly. He looked at his son, and for a long moment, Luke couldn't read his eyes. Then came 4 words, "We'll pray about it." Luke nodded, barely, and James returned to his desk. The next day, Eli arrived earlier than usual. His jeans were still damp from morning dew. He knelt by the sapling, adjusting one of the stones. When he stood, he noticed a shadow nearby. Luke stood there. He said nothing. Just handed Eli a folded piece of paper and walked off. Eli opened it, a sketch rough but tender. It was the courtyard, drawn from above. In the center, a new symbol had been penciled in 2 benches facing each other, connected by the spiraling path. No words, just that image. And it said more than Luke ever could. At the next committee meeting, Dorothy slammed her hand on the table. "That boy's getting too close," she said. "Too involved. First the gardener, now the benches, the drawings, the poetry in the bulletin. What next?" Pastor James sat silently. Dorothy continued, "It's not about landscaping anymore. He's trying to turn our church into a sanctuary for confusion." But James didn't argue. He looked out the window, at the pear sapling, at the stone path, at his son, who now lingered there more than in his room. And he asked himself, not for the first time, what if clarity wasn't found in what we preserve, but in what we allow to grow? The rain came without warning. Not a drizzle, not a spring shower. A full-throated, sideways storm that slammed against windows, shook the church bell in its steeple, and turned the garden into mud before midnight had even arrived. Most people stayed inside, closing blinds and turning up the television. But Eli Grayson returned. His truck headlights cut through the downpour as he pulled into the church lot, wipers struggling to keep up. He stepped out, hoodless, soaked within seconds. He made no run for cover. Instead, he walked straight to the sapling, now leaning, its thin trunk straining under the weight of the wind. He knelt beside it, digging his hands into the soil. The stones had scattered, the sign had toppled, but he worked with purpose, realigning the roots, pressing earth back into place with bare fingers. He didn't notice the porch light flick on behind him. Pastor James stood under the awning, arms crossed against the cold, watching a man work in silence to save something no one else believed needed saving. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. Eli didn't look up. "Last time I stood here, it was raining too," he said. "I was 15. I asked to stay, just for one night. They said I made people uncomfortable." James's face tightened. Memory is a cruel thing. It arrives not when asked, but when accused. And the image came back, as clear as the lightning overhead. A thin boy, holding a wet duffel bag, a volunteer whispering, a signature on a line that said, "Refuse shelter." That signature had been his. Before James could respond, a voice cut through the storm. "You need to leave this place." Dorothy May, in a plastic rain bonnet and long coat, had appeared from the far end of the sidewalk. She held an umbrella in one hand and a letter in the other, sealed with the emblem of the church council. "We received a complaint," she shouted, "that you've been spending time alone with the pastor's son, that you've crossed boundaries." Eli stood slowly. His shirt clung to him. He didn't move forward. He didn't flinch. "I've crossed no lines," Dee said, but Dorothy's voice rose over the wind. "You've been sketching with him, speaking to him in the garden after school, letting him linger around you like some—" She stopped herself, but the word was already there. James didn't speak. Not yet. And then Luke stepped into the light. He didn't have an umbrella. His clothes were soaked. But he walked forward, past the porch, past his father, and stood directly between Dorothy and Eli. He didn't shout. He didn't tremble. "If you're accusing him of something," Luke said, "accuse me too." Dorothy's jaw clenched, her fingers tightened around the letter, but she didn't hand it over. The rain fell harder. Eli looked at Luke not with pride, not with gratitude, but something deeper. Recognition. The look two people share when they've both been told they don't belong and have stopped believing it. James turned to Dorothy. "Go home, Dorothy." She hesitated, lips parted, but the authority in his voice left no space for reply. She turned and walked off, heels slipping slightly on the wet stone path. James stood beside his son now, still silent. The storm had softened. Eli crouched down again, pressing the final stone back around the sapling's base. He didn't say anything more. Luke joined him. Together, they covered the roots. It wasn't a sermon. It wasn't a lesson. It was just a boy and a gardener, choosing not to run. The garden's dedication was scheduled for the first Sunday in June. Flyers had gone out. Folding chairs were arranged beneath the willow tree. The pear sapling stood taller now, its leaves fresh from the recent rain. Someone had placed a ribbon across the spiral path blue, not red as if trying to match the gentleness of what was built. Pastor James hadn't prepared a sermon. He had tried. Each time he opened his notes, his pen stilled. The pages remained blank, not from lack of thoughts, but because words had started to feel inadequate. That morning, the sanctuary was full, not just regulars, strangers too, people from other congregations, curious neighbors, a few quiet students who had heard rumors about a garden and a boy. Luke sat in the front row, dressed simply, his hands folded in his lap. Eli stood near the back, unnoticed by most, his hat in his hands. James stepped to the front without his Bible. He held something smaller, a thin wooden plaque, smoothed around the edges, worn at the corners. The same plaque Eli had once staked into the soil beside the tree. He looked out at the crowd and paused. But before he could speak, a familiar voice rang out. "I'd like to read something first." Dorothy May stood, not seeking permission. She held a piece of paper and read aloud, her voice sharp and unshaken. "Leviticus says, if a man lies with a man as one lies with a woman, both have done what is detestable. This is the word of the Lord." The silence afterward was not agreement. It was tension thick and brittle. She looked at James, defiant, then at Luke, then at Eli. James didn't respond to her, not directly, instead, he turned to his son. "Luke," he said softly, "can I have that book?" Luke stood, reached into his satchel, and handed him a thin, worn journal. Eli's journal. James held it like something sacred. "I received this just a few days ago," he said. It was written nearly 20 years ago by a boy who once stood outside this very church, soaking wet, asking for shelter. He opened to a folded page and began to read, not with drama, but with trembling simplicity. "Dear Pastor, I'm sorry if I looked wrong or spoke too soft. I know I don't belong. I don't want trouble. I just need a place to sleep. I can help with the garden. I'm good with plants. I don't steal. I just don't know where else to go." James stopped. His hands were shaking now. "I never read this," he admitted. "Back then, I signed a paper and moved on. I thought I was doing my job. I thought protecting the church meant shutting doors." He looked directly at Dorothy. "But maybe protection isn't always about walls." He turned toward Eli. "That boy who begged for shelter, he's the man who built the garden behind this sanctuary. And in all these years, I never once asked what that night did to him." The room held its breath. James continued. "My son, Luke, told me he's gay, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. I only knew how to pray the discomfort away. But then I saw him kneel beside that tree with a man the world had taught him to fear, and I saw grace." He stepped down from the podium, walked to the front of the sanctuary, and set the journal on the communion table. "I'm not here to debate verses," he said. "I'm here to admit that I was wrong." No applause followed. No one moved. But something deeper happened. Shoulders relaxed. A few eyes welled. Someone in the back exhaled as if they had been holding their breath for years. Luke stood, quietly, and for the first time, openly. He walked to Eli. They didn't embrace. They didn't need to. They stood side by side, looking out at a room that still hadn't decided whether it was ready to change. But the decision wasn't theirs to wait for. They had already changed. The ribbon was never cut. After the service ended, people slowly made their way out into the courtyard. No one spoke at first. They just walked the spiral path, ran their fingers along the rough edges of the bench, stood before the pear tree now held upright by a simple rope and 2 wooden stakes. Some sat, some wept quietly. Others simply stood in silence, as if trying to understand what had changed in the span of a single hour. Eli stayed back, standing near the old tool shed, out of sight but not out of reach. James eventually joined him. No words passed between them, just a nod acknowledgement without ceremony. Later that evening, as the sun softened and shadows stretched, Luke returned to the garden. He was alone, or so he thought. On the bench sat a small brown envelope. Inside it, a single packet of lilac seeds and a note handwritten in elegant cursive. "I once pulled you from this ground. I hope these grow where I could not." It wasn't signed, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Dorothy May had planted her first apology. James found her the following Sunday sitting at the very back of the sanctuary. Not in her usual seat. She didn't speak during the hymns. She didn't rise during the blessing. But she stayed until the very last word and walked out slower than usual, pausing only once to run her fingers along the garden gate that was never installed. In the weeks that followed, more benches appeared, quietly, without announcement. One under the tree, one beneath the old steeple, another facing the parking lot, as if to say that even departures are part of the journey. Luke graduated that summer. He received a scholarship anonymous in its origin, but mailed with a hand-addressed envelope. The sender rooted Grace Fund. No signature, just a small pressed leaf enclosed inside, the same shape as those from the sapling in the church garden. The day before he left for college, Luke visited the garden one last time. Eli was there, pruning a vine that had outgrown its post. "You never told anyone about the fund," Luke said. Eli smiled, soft but steady. "Not everything needs to be traced to be trusted." Luke sat on the bench beside him. "Are you staying?" he asked. Eli nodded toward the tree. "As long as something still needs tending." James continued to preach each Sunday, but something in him had shifted. The way he opened his Bible now came with less certainty, more wonder. He asked more questions from the pulpit than he gave answers. And when he looked at the congregation, he looked longer. He listened more. And sometimes in the middle of a sermon, he would pause mid-thought, mid-sentence, as if remembering a time when he almost didn't make room for grace. But he did, and that made all the difference. One autumn afternoon, a visitor walked through the garden. He was new in town. He asked an older man nearby, "Why isn't there a fence around this place? Feels like it should be protected." The old man chuckled. "Because the ones who built it needed something that didn't shut people out." The visitor nodded slowly and sat on the bench facing east. The tree swayed gently. The stones stayed in place. And the garden, still, was open. Have you ever gone back to a place that once turned you away, just to make sure it welcomes the next person who walks in? If this story rooted something in you, subscribe to Heartstories, because the gardens we build today can become shelter for someone else tomorrow.